So today we have something special for you. This is Coffee Party Talks. This is a program that the Coffee Party started a couple of years ago, where we bring in guests to discuss matters that are very important to communities, individually and as a whole. And today we have a special guest to do just that, Thom Hartmann, who, for those of you who know of Thom, he's been around a long time. He's been doing good works for a long time. He's been politically engaged for a long time. And he just wrote a new book called The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. So first of all, let me just remind everybody who you are, of course. So, Thom Hartmann has been around a long time. As I said, he's written, I believe, 24, 25 books, New York Times bestsellers in multiple languages. He's been involved in community empowerment forever. He's been involved in nonprofit work, in community organizing, certainly journalism, certainly talking about very important issues in our society for a very long time. I'm not a labeler guy myself personally, so I don't care what the political persuasion is. I care about what the works is all about. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on that. And Thom just wrote a very important book, particularly with what just happened again in our society, the hidden history of the guns and the Second Amendment. And of course, first of all, good morning again, Thom. And I wanted you to, if you wouldn't mind, we know the obvious reasons, of course, and most people know you. You are well known, of course. But there had to be extra special reasons to write the book that you did. And I just would talk a little bit about what inspired you, I guess would be the word. I don't know if inspire is the right word, but let's go with it.
Yeah. We're in the middle of a massive public health crisis that really goes beyond public health. It's also a democracy crisis. The control of our judiciary and our legislative branch by right-wing ideologues and an entire industry, the gun industry. But, when you go to the airport, if you're going to fly someplace, as they're boarding the plane, first, they say, handicapped people and little kids, and then they say military, right? We honor our military because these are people who are literally marching into gunfire. They're literally putting themselves in a position where they could die at the end of a gun. Whenever a cop is killed anywhere in the country, it happened here in Portland a couple months ago. They basically shut the city down for the funeral. We honor our police officers because they put their bodies in the line of fire. If you add up all the cops who were killed last year, and you could do this for any of the last 2 decades, all the cops who were killed in the United States on duty, and all the military that were killed, American military that were killed all over the world, the number is still, and add those two numbers together, that number is still significantly smaller than the number of children who were killed with guns in the United States.
And that's an amazing statistic. It's interesting. You raise some, and we can go down the rabbit hole after after we get into your book a little bit more. The military aspect of it and our law enforcement. I have my personal. I'm a veteran, and my personal view, of course, is we choose to be where we are, and we take an oath, and we should honor our oath, which of course is another aspect of what goes on in our society that isn't done. In my opinion, I have this little bit of a harsh view of, it may be a harsh view, I don't know. I just think it's more of I don't get to violate the oath when I was in the service. And a lot of people are violating their oath, from the standpoint of the police and from the standpoint of elected officials, unfortunately, which I think is part of the problem that has happened with our gun and violence in our society, because we do sensationalize the perpetrators. We do sensationalize the gun thing. The NRA is interesting, to say the least. I think the recent revelations about the corruption inside the organization kind of shows a little bit about that. But from the historical perspective, which is where you went down, I have to tell you, the book is impressive. Personally, I don't necessarily agree with some of the views you have that you're expressing, but I respect immensely the amount of work that was put in. Is very well done. The information is wonderful, of course. And my differences are liberty-based, not necessarily in the societal public health thing. I totally agree with you that we have a public health crisis. I totally agree that we have a situation with politics in general where the best interests of the people are not being looked after. And I think that's more about what this is about than anything. That's how I took it, is that it's really about the best interests of our society that you're trying to point out more than anything else. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to extend that thought, when our children go to school, you know, we're not treating them the way that we treat soldiers when they're boarding planes or cops when they get killed. And yet they're going to school now where they're having active shooting drills that are traumatizing children. I mean, there's just, it's becoming very well documented how severely traumatized these kids are. I was a kid in the 1950s, and I remember well being in the second, third, and maybe fourth grade, you know, through the mid 50s. You know, the bell would go off and we'd all jump under our desks, and we'd have to, the whole way of covering your eyes with your fingers and your ears with your thumbs so that the nuclear blast didn't blind you or blow out your eardrums. And you know, we didn't really take it all that seriously. I mean, I can tell you, these kids today, what's going on is they're trying to make these active shooter drills as real as possible. They in many cases even have people running around inside the schools with guns that are shooting blanks. And the teachers and the kids don't know if it's real or not. It's scaring the hell out of them. And when children are frightened like that in their youth, it alters the way the brain works. It alters the way the brain responds to cortisol. And it causes them to become, you know, it's basically a form of PTSD, only it's one that causes people to become, if not disabled, basically authoritarians. It puts people into fight or flight mode, and it makes them far more vulnerable to authoritarian and authority figures. And you know, we're raising a generation of kids who are being essentially programmed to say, you know, yes sir and Sieg Heil, and that worries me. And to have, you know, just extraordinary pain inflicted upon them psychologically throughout their entire lives, you know, by this early trauma. So. You know, we've got a serious problem here.
You know, and I fully agree that you mentioned some things that I'll comment on too. I work myself, the Juvenile Justice Committee of the American Bar Association. One of the things that we've been advocating, for example, that kind of ties into the mindset of programming is removing the police from the schools,
right,
and also the school to prison pipeline that has been going on for so long. So it's all, yeah, it really is. So, and so then you mentioned the drills, and of course, I've never been in a nuclear. I grew up in the '60s, so essentially, what you were doing was change to fire drills. Well, they didn't like the fire, and then have us, you know, they didn't have a fake fire going on or a fire going on to drive us out. We did a thing. They told us what to do. They did the organization. They checked on everybody being in the drill, and then they sent it back. That's what a drill is. I mean, and even in the military, when we did a drill, you know, yeah, we went into a room and we had to take our mask off and we had to cite the orders of the century before we passed out from, you know, I mean, I get that. But, you know,
but you know you're not going to die.
Right.
And these kids with these drills right now, in many cases, actually think they're going to die. You got some reports of kids, you know, wetting themselves, falling into inconsolable sobbing that sometimes lasts for days as a consequence of some of these drills. I mean, this is... And it's bizarre. The politicians who are in the pocket of the NRA, they come out and say, well, the solution is to give teachers guns. You know, that's crazy.
Which they've done in Florida and other places, as we know, and Texas is looking at it now as well.
Yeah.
You know,
on its face. I mean, ask any cop, you know, should civilians be running around with guns in rooms full of children? No.
No, well, I mean, and then of course it goes on to the other side where, you know, we know that the police don't want anybody to have guns, which is a whole nother subject we don't need to go into. But, you know, the interesting thing about what you were raising with the drills, for example, we've all read recently, well, at least I know you and I have, when they actually were pretending to be Muslims running around. And then we had another incident where teachers were shot with the pellets that you were talking about, or the dummy bullets that were happening. I was blown away when I saw that. I said, you got to be kidding me. You know, a drill is just a drill. Yeah, you could, you know, look, what happens if somebody comes in who's armed? There's your premise. Okay. Right. We're going to lock these doors. We're going to move these kids, and that's it. Period. End of story. I mean, to do what they're doing, as you mentioned, is absurd, and it is a programming thing. And you know, we've been going back to the juvenile justice aspects. It's a programming thing that goes on now, where so when we raise the issue of taking the police out of the schools, the pushback is immense because of, you know, the right side of the reasoning when you talk about, you know, Columbine and the protection aspects. Yeah, I get it. But that's not what's going on. That's not the main thing that's going on when you have the police in the schools and things like that as well, as you know. So it's just...
Authoritarianism comes out of fear.
At big time. And it works really well. And it's something that has been going on. And, you know, we have aspects of... It's interesting, you know, you talk about the NRA, and I'll jump to something else too, because it also, you have the racist aspects of what goes on, the ethnic issues. So my organization, a couple of nonprofits, we were on the ground in Ferguson. We went there, you know, with the journalism hats on. You know, we were around a lot of people. We have a coalition that before Stuart Rhodes lost his mind again, we actually worked with the Oath Keepers, for example, et cetera. And Ferguson was an interesting situation because most of the violence that was happening was coming from outside entities that didn't live in the town. The inside people were being treated really bad, and a lot of journalists got treated really bad. We saw it, you know, with our own eyes. So nobody's going to tell me that it didn't happen. But the thing that came out of that was interesting, that the pushback happened, is why I'm mentioning this, is that there was a faction of, actually, he was an Oath Keeper at the time, who was saying, okay, well, let's do an armed rally with the local community, which means the majority of the people would be black. You know, and that, to me, that doesn't matter. I could care less. You know, if you're going to do something, whoever's there is their community. And of course, the pushback was crazy, and the NRA was completely silent because they don't do it that way.
Oh, Philando Castile. I mean, here's
bingo.
Here's a black guy who's you know, a good, upstanding, middle class citizen who's got a concealed carry permit, and the police pull him over, and his girlfriend is videotaping it. And the cop says, and he says to the cop, I have a gun, weapons permit, and I have a gun in the car, and I would be glad to show you the permit. And the cop says, fine, show me the permit. And he reaches into his back pocket to pull out his wallet, and the cop shoots him dead. Yeah. I mean, it's like, really?
It's amazing as well. And we had the incident even more recently in Alabama, where you had the security guard, the black security guard, who was saving a situation and got shot because black man with a gun. And, you know, there was a Ford Fisher, who was a young... Ford Fisher was a young, wonderful young journalist who has news to share, is out there in the front lines in a lot of really, really intense rallies that go on. So he was just up in the Dayton, Ohio situation where they had the KKK rally, and there was a big response from anti-KKK people. And one of the groups that showed up was the local Black Panther group, and they were armed. And it was interesting seeing the comments in the stream, and, you know, and then of course the lack of acknowledgement by the NRA. So, you know, the NRA, when we were younger, Tom, they were about teaching people safety. That's where they came from. That was the original reason why they existed. And then of course they went off the deep end like so many people do, in the annals of money and ideologue and all that other stuff.
Well, they were taken over basically in the 70s by the weapons industry. There was basically a corporate takeover of the NRA, and the NRA turned from being a sportsman's group, you know, which I was familiar with. I took a gun safety course from the NRA in the 60s.
Sure.
It converted itself from that into a lobbying group, a very effective lobbying.
Yeah, they made the industry a lot of money. I read something just this morning, and just thinking about subject matter to talk with you about relative to Virginia Beach, of course, which is we'll get into. And of course, that particular person had a silencer, and I wasn't aware of that when I first saw the reports. So when I saw
many of the people in the offices didn't run, and you know, they didn't know what was going on.
Didn't hear the bullet.
Yeah, because the suppressor made it sound like, you know, and maybe fireworks going off in the next building.
And of course, the instant pushback was that had no impact on how many people were died. And you know, I'm like, are you saying that with a straight face?
Right.
You know, I mean, even no matter how you feel about whether or not we should have suppressors in our society, just start there. that comment is absurd. It doesn't, of course it had an impact on how many people that were killed. That was the point of having it on there. They're saying, well, the only reason why they exist is because, of the loudness of bullets hurting eardrums. Okay, great, but you're not on a gun range. This is a real live situation where people are being butchered. So to even say that, you can't even have a reasonable debate about the issue when people are coming from the other side with that lunacy. The thing that disturbed me the most, and again, back to the corporate takeover side of the gun industry, is the entity that has the majority of the sales in that area. When suppressors first came out politically, they were doing 18,000 a year. Now they're doing more than that a month. Yeah, so I'm like, okay. So we have that many out there, and of course, suppressors are, I think over 30 anyway. Maybe it might be 40, but over 30 states, of course, allow suppressors as well. There's no uniformity. There is a background check that requires a 6-month thing, and they're looking into whether or not this person went through that, the guy in Virginia Beach. But that's a serious issue here to have a conversation about for any kind of, and this is coming from an ex-FBI person who's actually saying this. So the whole credential thing is part of that. And I just was blown. I mean, like I said, I wore the uniform. You can't sit there and tell me that didn't have an impact. I would have been dead. I wouldn't have known that there was something going on. We're hearing a certain noise. It's amazing the rhetoric that comes out in these situations.
Yep, I agree.
So the hidden history. I mean, it's I get it. The discussions, we have a lot of hidden history. I mean, if you look at like corporate personhood, for example, that's a wonderful hidden history that we have. It's amazing that we have corporations that are considered people, and most people don't know that it's actually codified in subsection 1 of the United States Code from Congress, and most people don't even know where that came from. So take us a little bit down that road. I mean, starting from the beginning, when tell people why you have the position that you do.
With regard to guns.
Yes, and the history of the Second Amendment and why it's not, as your book talks about, the perception of what is protected and what isn't on the basis of the Second Amendment.
Just FYI, I wrote a book on the hidden history of corporate personhood. It's called Unequal Protection, The Rise of Corporate Dominance. Good
to know. I will find it and read it.
Yeah. With regard to guns, in the beginning, at the founding of our republic, mm-hmm. there were 2 arguments basically made for the Second Amendment. The first argument was really the 90% argument. It was what brought the Second Amendment into the Constitution. Madison kind of managed and certainly kept all the records for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And his mentor, lifelong mentor, Thomas Jefferson, was in Paris at the time as the United States envoy to France. And so that fall, after the Constitution was written, he sent a copy of it to Jefferson and said, here's our new Constitution. What do you think, boss? And Jefferson writes back, and you can easily find and read these letters. They're among the more well-known. Jefferson writes back, I like the fact that you split the government into 3 parts, and I like the checks and balances, and I like this, and I like this. But he says, now I will tell you what I do not like. And he goes through this list. He says, we have to have absolutely ironclad, I mean, that's not the phrase he uses. He used the word unremitting or unrelenting power of habeas corpus. There has to be an absolute ban on monopolies in commerce. That's the one thing that he pushed that didn't make it into the Constitution.
Right.
He said that there has to be freedom of the press and of religion. There has to be, he went through basically the amendments, and he said, and this is the one that created the Second Amendment, and he said there must be an absolute ban on standing armies during times of peace. And what the framers understood, because they were all students of European history, was that probably the main way that republics had fallen over the previous 1,000, 2,000 years was from within. A country would become prosperous. They'd build an army. They'd look at the guys next door, the next country over, and say, hey, we should take their resources. And so the army goes and invades them. And now we're twice as big and we're twice as rich. And the army comes home and there's no more war. And the army's sitting around going, what do we do now? Well, let's take over the government. And military coups were basically one of the main ways that governments changed hands. And the founders did not want that to ever happen here. So there was this strong objection in 5 of the states at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, or the time of the writing of the Constitution. There were actually provisions in the state constitutions that forbade the state from having a standing militia, essentially a standing army, or argued against standing armies and calling them, weapons against liberty and things like that. And so the original Second Amendment, the first draft of the Second Amendment, or actually the final draft, before it went to ratification, was, said that, for the security of a free nation, and then also had a provision in it that said that people who have religious objections to military service can be exempted from this.
Sure, conscientious objectors, yeah.
Right. So, and in fact, during that time, it was the Quakers. They were anti-military, and there were a lot of Quakers, particularly in Pennsylvania. And so the Second Amendment was written to replace a standing army, which was still extant. I mean, it still existed as a consequence of the Revolutionary War, George Washington's army, to replace that with state-based militias, much like Switzerland has, where, every man between the ages of 17 and 47 was 49 was the age range that the founders were debating and discussing.
Yeah.
Would be required to be a member of the state militia, and once a month they'd go to training. And if the country was ever invaded from the British-controlled Canada in the north, or the French-controlled Florida in the south, or whatever it might be, then the militias would be called up by the president, and that's envisioned in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution as well. Mm-hmm. So the 2 ways that the founders tried to make sure that we would never have a military-industrial complex, because we'd never have a permanent military, was number 1, with the Second Amendment establishing state militias, and number 2 was in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where it says basically the ability of Congress to raise taxes, to raise money, and to spend money is unlimited. The Article 1, Section 8 opens by referencing the general welfare of the country, which is also referenced in the preamble, and it closes by again citing the general welfare. General welfare, huge rubric.
Yeah.
George Washington started the first welfare programs. The George Washington signed legislation providing for the medical care, housing, feeding, and clothing of poor people in Washington, D.C. It was done. Yeah,
one of the organizations that I'm with just actually did one of the radio shows that we broadcast. He just actually did a historical perspective on that particular item, because of the stuff that goes on today in medical, and to show that this is not, the mindset is not new. The founders
Right. So and in Article 1, Section 8, they added this provision that said, okay, Congress can tax money for anything, it can spend money on anything, with one single exception. And that is the military, with the exception of the Navy, which they wanted to have, protecting our waters at all times. But with the exception of the Navy, no part of the military may be funded for more than 2 years, period. Which is why Congress, freaks out and shuts down every 2 years around the military appropriations bill, because if that bill isn't passed, the military ceases to exist, or large chunks of it cease to exist. And, that was the idea of the founders. We don't want to have a standing army during times of peace, period, full stop. Well, that ship has sailed. So anyhow, that was the origin of the Second Amendment. That's where it first came from. Then it went to the states for ratification as part of the Constitution, or actually the Constitution went for ratification, and the amendments were ratified separately a couple of years later. But they were sold as a package, basically, to the states. And so at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Patrick Henry, who was the largest slaveholder in the state and was very politically active in Virginia, gets up and was a famed orator. This is the "Give me liberty or give me death" guy.
Right.
He gets up and he says, Article 1, Section 8 of this Constitution gives the president the power to call up the militia. And, our militia here in Virginia is also our slave patrol. This was the case in Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. And the slave patrols were were state militias. They were required, people, every white man, 17 to 49 or 47, was required to be a member. They had to show up regularly. In Virginia, every weekend or, one day a week, they had to patrol their region of the state with weapons, looking for black people who shouldn't be there, or slaves who've run away, or black people who are misbehaving, and in quotes. And so Patrick Henry gets up and says, if we get a Northerner as a president, basically, somebody who is opposed to slavery, he could destroy our militia by calling it up for federal service and saying the Virginia militia has to go up to Massachusetts. Well, if our slave patrol leaves, our slaves are going to revolt. He understood, as everybody in the South understood, the only way you can have slavery as an institution is in the context of a police state. You have to run a police state. People are not willingly submit to slavery.
Absolutely.
And the police state was enforced by guns and by these militias. So Patrick Henry gets up and he gives this speech, and the speech is in the book. And,
right, I read it, yeah.
Yeah, James Madison says to him, essentially, he doesn't use the word paranoid, but that's what he says. He says, I think you're being paranoid here. There's, this is not contemplated. This is not how it would work. It's, forget it. Mm-hmm. And Patrick Henry says, no, he says, I'm going to blow this thing up. If Virginia refuses to ratify the Constitution, you don't have a country. And we will not ratify this Constitution with the Second Amendment that says that, that you can call up our slave patrol. And so Madison changes the language from "for the security of a free nation" to "for the security of a free state." And he drops the part about military service and religious objections. And the religious objection part had nothing to do with slave patrols. So this was, Madison, a slave owner, saying to Patrick Henry, the largest slave owner in Virginia, okay, we got your back. And that is where the modern Second Amendment came from, full stop. Now, in the 70s, in the mid-70s, the NRA's magazine, The Rifleman, published an op-ed by a teenager that suggested, without any links to anything historical, simply suggested it, that the founders actually wrote the Second Amendment because if the government should ever become oppressive, then we need guns to rise up and overthrow the government, which is not only was not part of any of the debates or any of the discussions at the Constitutional Convention itself, in the correspondences among the founders and the framers, particularly Jefferson and Madison, and was never discussed in any of the ratifying conventions that I can find. And I believe that I've read all of them. Mm-hmm. Literally, nobody was having that conversation. In fact, they were trying to prevent the country from becoming oppressive by banning the standing military. Instead, they were talking about banning the standing military. But this idea that somehow if our government turns into Hitler's government, with an AR-15 or a Sig Sauer, we're going to be able to take down Black Hawk helicopters and drones, and we're going to be more successful than the Iraqis were, or the Syrians were, or the Afghanis were in fighting the United States military. Is a crazy idea, but it has infiltrated the hard right in ways that are just extraordinary. And there are even some people on the left who subscribe to this notion. It was never part of the dialogue. It was never part of the discussion, but it's become part of the NRA mythology. And it's very unfortunate because it obscures the very real issues of our government moving in fascist directions and how we should respond to that. And so
I actually, it's interesting. First of all, the real situational historical, the real historical situation where that issue was relevant was in the original revolution when, Britain was confiscating guns from local people, but had nothing to do, as you say. I totally agree with you. I'm pretty well versed in what happened back then as well. And I totally agree with you. Those discussions never happened in the constitutional discussions and the ratifications. And I've never seen anything to that regard. I always reference when I reference that mindset, I think about the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts, for example, and the incidents that happened when they were actually searching for the caches of weapons, because essentially it was a war going on. So it's a different situation.
Well, they were fighting a foreign occupying power.
Yeah, it was a different situation. It's a whole right. So I totally understand.
If you want an example of the people rising up and saying, okay, the government is oppressive, we're going to overthrow the government. If you want an example of that here in the United States, that's the argument the South was making.
Right.
That we
Right.
have to secede from the Union, and we have to kill anybody who wants to stop us, because we are being oppressed in our ability to enslave people of color.
Right. You know, and the slaving, the slave trade thing. I mean, we have a country that actually traded votes. So there was a and I'm sure you know about this. But when we were talking about the slave trade, and there was certain northern states, Pennsylvania particularly, would not honor, the returning of slaves who had escaped.
The fugitive slave.
Yeah, and yeah. So what a lot of people don't know is that the reason that the South continued to get away with that is because they exchanged votes to bring in a new state, in order to make the country bigger. So they dropped the entire 10th Amendment argument. The 10th Amendment's an interesting argument in our historically. We haven't had enough of them, in my opinion. But the South gave trouble. Obviously we had a civil war, and it's still getting, and in post Civil War into to today. But you're right. I'm not familiar with the article, but I am very familiar with the mindset of the NRA and that argument. And I'm not an anti-gun personal thing, but I don't go with the oppressive nature of the argument. It's absurd, as you say. The war thing, though, is very important. You mentioned Article 1, Section 8, and then, of course, we all know that there was a tax implied in order to deal with World War I. And that's pretty much where we've gone down this income tax road that now exists. It's interesting you mentioned the 2-year time frame, because, of course, we've remained in perpetual war of some kind, one way or the other, forever. And I think people need to make that correlation as well. But staying on point, you're right. In my opinion, you're right. And I do think that there needs to be, there always needs to be in our society more honesty in our discussions, more factual discussions. We are hearing a lot of yelling and a lot of hard ideological situation from all label sides. I really hate labels. I just can't stand it. But you're right. You have, the people are not, there's false arguments going on here. We're not arguing about something that is real. If you're going to talk about the constitutional protections, let's talk about them. I always bring up the abortion issue when people say, well, pro-choice, pro-life, this is a moral argument. I'm like, no, it's not. I said, if you don't want abortion in our society, repeal the Fourth Amendment. Otherwise, shut up. Because that's really the issue here. I get everything else, but when it comes to the constitutional argument, Roe was actually decided. It's one of the few cases that really was decided properly on what the constitutional protection is, if you look at it. And they're not doing that with what the real, like you mentioned, what the real argument. Now, if they want to rule that way, fine, but have the discussion on the basis of what's factual. What the hell do we do about that, Thom? I mean, give me the Hartmann solution, please, because geez, it's crazy out here. How do we make sure the argument is factual, like you have? I mean, obviously everybody needs to read your book, but where do we take this discussion now?
Robert, you've opened a huge topic, and and frankly, not a new one, by the way. I'm guessing back around the time of Gutenberg, they were freaking out that suddenly people were publishing pamphlets and books.
Yeah.
Arguably a pamphlet, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, kicked off the American Revolution.
Yeah.
These are the times that try men's souls.
Great book.
Yeah, a pamphlet. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And it's technology. With every advance of technology, not only has there been an advance in information, but there's been an advance of misinformation.
Yeah.
And
it's like the Tokyo Rose situation. That's why I call a lot of this is like we live in a Tokyo Rose world, and then of course we have a whole society doesn't even remember who Tokyo Rose is, and I explained it to him like, oh, I said, yeah, it's propaganda, it's.
Oh, Reed, you would love John Paul Stevens' dissent in Citizens United.
Oh, yes. I'm very familiar. I mean, Coffee Party USA was founded on Citizens United. I'm very familiar with Stevens' dissent. Absolutely.
Yeah. And he mentions Tokyo Rose in that.
Yes.
He says Tokyo Rose under this decision, Citizens United, under this decision, Tokyo Rose could be funding a candidate for Congress.
Yes, yes.
I mean, really?
To me, it cuts right to the chase. You know, this is. I mean, guys, when I have the Tokyo Rose discussion, it's like we you know, you're a prisoner, you're a prisoner in Japan, and she's sitting there saying, "Yeah, we just bombed San Francisco." You know, what do you do with that? You know,
They were broadcasting it to U.S. troops too.
yeah, all over the place. It was crazy, and of course we had the German version of the same thing. You know, and this went on. And as you say, the more information out there, the easier it is. I mean, we see every single day, you and I see on the internet, false reporting constantly, even by the big boys. You know, everybody's reporting what somebody else said in order for the line to be first. I always found it interesting that the 24-hour news cycle started when Ronald Reagan became president, who was probably the main reason why I became an activist in my life, even though I was one. I mean, I argued with my father about the Vietnam War when I was 10. You know, but Saint Reagan, as I call him, when he became the president, it was the things that happened under his regime are insane, and he made me pay attention. You know, and we expand, and of course the military-industrial complex that was warned about by Eisenhower and discussed in the original constitutional conventions was enhanced under Reagan in ways that had never really happened. You know,
the other thing, bringing this back to guns and militarism, the other thing that Reagan did, and truth be told, he got the idea from Maggie Thatcher. You know, when Maggie Thatcher did the whole Falklands thing, you know, a little war that had very little risk, and her popularity went from underwater to over 75, 80% as a consequence of winning the Falkland War. You know, basically Reagan turned to his people and said, you know, I need one of those too. You know, we've got re-election coming up and all this kind of stuff. So what's my little war going to be? And they found this little island in the Caribbean,
Grenada,
where Maurice Bishop was the president. He had been, the elected president, but he was a socialist, and he was reaching out to Castro. And there was this medical school there, which is still there, by the way. A friend of mine just graduated, and you know, he said, we've got to save the American students in the medical school. And so, you know, they sent in the Marines, and they killed a few people, and they liberated the students, who went back to classes a week later.
Yeah.
But Reagan had his little war. And, you know, Jimmy Carter was the last American president to serve his entire term without having a little war.
Right.
Reagan started this, and he had his little war in Grenada. Then George H.W. Bush had his little war in Baghdad. You know, it only lasted 100 hours. And then
so on and so on.
War in Bosnia and Serbia, although you can argue
Somalia and
and then you know, George W. Bush had
then they got better at it. Then they got better at the propaganda when Iraq came along, and I know. You know, it's funny. I worked for Reagan. I was in the Navy under Reagan, and I saw it all with my own eyes. The build up. You know, I was an operations specialist, so I had top secret clearance, and it's my job to know how good we are at war. That's what an operations specialist does. I know every weapon. I know every weapon carrier. I have to protect the United States Navy. I work in Combat Information Center. There's nothing I didn't know about this subject. I still don't know. And all the phalanx and the SAM missiles, and then taking the aircraft carriers out of mothballs, and then of course, you know, it's interesting you mentioned Grenada, because the real incident that happened during Reagan was when the military barracks were blown up in the Marine barracks in Beirut. You know, and 200
Reagan just turned and ran.
Yeah, I mean, it was
200 dead Marines or soldiers. Or it was
253 Marines in the Marine barracks. We were, you know, so Grenada was the same, as you mentioned. I mean, that's again, we're looking at a situation now where we know what happened. We know how they can win. It's go to war. You know, we're looking at what's happening with the Iran rhetoric and the North Korea rhetoric and the Venezuela situation.
Tweeting in 2010. Just before the election, Trump tweeted, expect Obama to declare war on Iran any day now, because he needs that to win.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he did the same thing in 2012 when Obama was up for re-election. Trump repeatedly, five different times, Trump has tweeted, and this was during the Obama presidency, before he announced he was going to run for president, that Obama was going to start a war with Iran because it would be politically useful to him.
Sure.
Obviously, Trump thinks that way.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, he's got John Bolton working for him. He's got Abrams back. So we're talking about. I mean, that is the other thing about our wonderful military-industrial complex is that these guys don't go away. You go all the way back to Reagan, and all these people. I was at an event last year, a very good Bridge Alliance, a very good organization that Coffee Party works with, partners, co-founded by Deborah Lynn Molyneux, who used to be the Coffee Party president. Great organization. But I went to an event that they were involved with in D.C. last year, and McChrystal was being given an award, and I was internally freaking out because, Scahill exposed McChrystal, for example. But these guys have been around doing these behaviors for a very long time. I find the Manning situation just insane, because of course everything that Manning revealed happened was a criminal act that Manning was revealing, and yet Manning is and I get the whole reason why. Don't agree with it, but I get the whole reason why. And military justice is interesting, but you don't have anybody going after the people who are doing wrong. Snowden has been shown to be 100% right, all of these things. And this goes back to our propaganda aspect and the way that the gun discussion is part of that, along with, as you mentioned with your other book, Corporate Personhood. I am going to read that, by the way, because I'm up to here with corporations as people, like any reasonable person should be. So I guess what you're saying is we want to beat the propaganda back. I guess would that be a starting point? I think that means the same thing as what I'm saying. We need to have real debates and real factual debates, and not have this.
I think the biggest problem that we have right now with regard to disinformation, misinformation in our public spaces is the corporate concentration of our media.
Oh, absolutely, 100%, 100%.
Particularly our electronic media, radio and television.
Yeah.
And, we had a defense mechanism against that prior to 1996. And that was, local ownership laws, that radio and television stations had to be owned by local entities. They had to serve their local communities. They had to program in the public interest. And that got blown up in 1996 when Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of 96. And our airwaves got sold off, got auctioned off. And Clear Channel went from a couple dozen stations to over 1,000, and in radio and television, you saw the rise of right wing
and monopolies.
Our broadcast,
and then we already had the removal of what's the clause I'm thinking about that Reagan removed in '85. Yeah. So the Fairness Doctrine. Thank you. So we already had that removal, and again, I'm not a fan of government intervention all over the place, but that one was a good one. So what people don't realize is, and this has happened, you have these cases where media outlets are found to be lying or suppressing information that they have that is real. And the corporate personhood has allowed them to be given the First Amendment protections of freedom of speech. Is this and this is a thing, the public doesn't realize this is going on, so they go, oh, fake news. Well, if Fox News says something that's fake and they're sued, MSNBC will join them, amicus, supporting their position that they are allowed to lie, and vice versa. It has happened many times when a jury will award a plaintiff who has filed against a network, whatever, Fox News, MSNBC, that they lied, CNN, that they lied, suppressed, and whatever. The jury will side with the plaintiff. It'll get appealed, and here comes all of them together to file saying, no, we're allowed to lie because of corporate personhood. And we have, and so on that basis, we have the protection of being able to lie, and it's ludicrous. The whole thing is ludicrous.
Oh, check out, just go on the internet and Google or DuckDuckGo, Fox RGBH lawsuit. RGBH is a recombinant bovine growth hormone.
Yeah, that's in Florida. That's the Florida case.
Yeah, right.
And that's one of the examples of when it happened. The jury awarded them.
These two reporters. It was a married couple, husband.
Yes.
And they did a report on the RGBH being injected into cows and how it was showing up in the milk and how it may cause cancers and other problems in humans. And the local Fox station, from responding to pressure from Monsanto, had them alter their report over 20 times to try to make it conform. And finally, the final alteration said, and there's no problem with this. And at that point, these two reporters said, no, I'm not going to do this. The Fox station fired them. They sued for wrongful termination. It went before a jury. The
They
jury
won.
unanimously found that they were inappropriately fired, and ordered that the station had to give them a couple $100,000 and give them their job back. And then Fox appealed that to the federal courts, or maybe it was the state.
No, it was just a state appellate court. It was a state appellate court.
And the state appellate court said no. The television station has a First Amendment right to determine what's.
And they had 70 stations or 70 organizations, media organizations, line up as allies on that issue. Right, left, didn't matter. All those labels, it didn't matter. Everybody joined in to allow that to happen. Totally, the case is a prime example of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it really is, and it's unfortunate.
It is.
So I think that if we want to deal with the issue that you raised, opening this discussion of BS in the media, I think that step one is to bring competition back to the media and localization back to the media, and that means breaking up these big giants.
Yeah. The interesting, I work in independent media. This is essentially that. I work with a lot of younger people that are involved in independent media. Technically, The Intercept, I guess, would consider independent media to some degree, just with money, I guess, with some money. I have a lot of respect for Scale. Taibbi, of course, I did some work with him on the censorship of Facebook as they were putting out, stomping out all these things. And the independent media was the thing that was like, for the Facebook aspect of it, for right, wrong, or indifferent, they were the ones that were impacted the most. Anti-Media had 3 million followers, Free Thought Project. It doesn't matter what people think about them. These are people who are doing good works, and they were never shown to be fake, or, they're just that basically they got stomped on.
Stop Spider and Alternet and a bunch of other progressive sites.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. No, there was a whole bunch.
Facebook has on their board that determines, what is and isn't news. Right-wing websites.
Yeah, that was fun when they did that, and it was interesting because, again, you talk about allies, and of course, independent media warned everybody that, okay, Alex Jones is out of his mind. I'll say that publicly. I've said it many times. But what they were setting us up for, in my mind, was very clear. So now, when they get rid of him, everybody's on that side of, that's really great. And of course, Facebook is a private entity, but they get rid of him. It's a great thing. And then here they come across the board. And so now there's a numbness to this propaganda, or to, this way of thinking. And it goes right back to that board thing that you mentioned, which we have talked about in independent media immensely, is like, okay, so who gets to decide what's real and what isn't? And then we see all of these incorrect articles all the time. I mean, CNN is doing it just as much as anybody else. These media outlets are like, well, New York Times, well, the Washington Post reported as, and nobody's doing the work.
Well, and it's effective reporting on things like guns. I was watching
big time
MSNBC when that shooting in Virginia Beach happened 2 days ago, and the host brought on, and it was the live hour or two after the shooting, at 3, and the host brought on a gun expert, in quotes, and said, what do we have to do? And the guy said, well, 2 things. Number one, we need to be more vigilant about mental illness, and we need to do something about mental illness. And number 2, we have to do something about these target-rich environments, where it's.
Oh, I saw that. Yes.
And basically, this is the NRA argument. No more zones, and let's start. If you're going to worry about people killing people, let's start with psychiatrists' offices. And it's a BS argument. One of the things that we know about guns and mass shootings and just killings in general is that there is virtually a 1-to-1 association between the number of guns in a society and the amount of gun violence in that society, both homicidal, suicidal, and accidental. And if you want to reduce gun violence in the United States, simply reduce the number of guns. Country after country after country has demonstrated that you don't have to ban guns entirely. In fact, that's probably a very bad idea.
Sure.
But the idea that anybody can just walk into a gun store tomorrow morning buy a gun, take it out that afternoon and shoot somebody with it is nuts. You can't do that with a car. If you
Right.
if you want to drive a car,
Right.
you've got to go to a state office and prove
Yeah.
that you know how to drive and prove that you understand the laws. You have to go to a private for-profit company and buy insurance from them and prove
Yeah.
to them that you're a good risk for that insurance, that you don't have 3 drunk driving convictions, so that you've
Right.
never, and you have to have that car registered from the time it's manufactured until this time this is destroyed, and that registration has to be renewed every year. And if we just did those 3 simple things that we did with cars back,
Yeah, I have no issue with any of those, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I'm a liberty guy, and you know, but yeah, you have to. I mean, come on, you know, I'm in Georgia. Need I say more? You know,
I lived in Georgia for 13 years.
We can go into any gun show.
Yep.
And by a matter of fact, New York had sued. I think it was Georgia. New York had sued Georgia, and because the guns that they found were coming from that direction, you know. But I can go out and buy a gun right now, and it's not an issue, you know. And there's no way I'm ever going to agree with that. I have no problem with people being armed, but what's wrong? Like you say, you have to do that with a car, you know, and every other aspect. You're like, I'm anti-marriage license, but we have it, you know, and so we're going to do that. Why can't it be that way? It really is ludicrous that argument is, and it has to do with, like you said, it has to do with the nature of the foundation of their argument, which is a false foundation. I do agree with you on that from a constitutional standpoint. And it's interesting that, you know, our judges don't bring it up either. You know, I've read a number of gun decisions. I actually decided to read a couple after I read your book, and they're not discussing what needs to be discussed historically. And there's, you know, even the great constitutionalists.
Heller Scalia twisted history. He
totally. Yeah.
Lied, and I forget who wrote that one dissent that called him out and basically called him a liar. But you know, Heller was just bizarre. Scalia actually, he wanted to quote the founders, and he couldn't find any quote from the founders to back up an individual right to own guns, because there wasn't one.
Right.
In fact, it really wasn't even an issue back then. You know, owning a gun in the 1700s was like, you know, owning a brand new BMW right now. Guns were insanely expensive. They were precision instruments for the day. You know.
Yeah.
You know, a gun could cost more than a house.
Yeah.
And so this was not an issue. It literally was not ever discussed. And Scalia couldn't find, you know, anybody saying that. And so he finds this old Pennsylvania anti-federalist tract from the 1780s. The anti-federalists were the people who were opposed to the ratification of the Constitution.
Right.
They were opposed to the United States being the way it is and has been ever since 1789.
Right.
And this anti-federalist tract talked about the purpose of government is to assist the individual in protecting hearth and kin, and it has no reference to guns at all, right? And its whole point is, don't have a federal government. And Scalia quotes this particular tract in this
as a gun rights. Yeah.
Sounds 17th century, right? And it's like.
And it's not that founders either, which is what's interesting, because they're supposed to be talking about what, you know, I mean, legislative intent, right? You know, whenever you have a situation, legislative intent is what they talk about. And there's nothing, I totally support what you're saying there. There's no legislative intent to go down that road, without a doubt.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, Thom, thank you so much.